to where we're headed now, and where just to set you up for tomorrow's session. So now, Des, I'm going to call on you. We're a little bit over time, so we're going to have to sort of synthesize many thoughts into about a half an hour.
I didn't bring my synthesizer.
And then, as I mentioned, we're going to immediately after we can go downstairs to a restaurant called Joyce. If that interests you, we're just facilitating that. It's not required. It's not even part of it. It's just a social opportunity for you that you can take advantage of as you like or not. Now we're going to give it back to Bassett to talk about identity, self-sovereignty, and just to really bring the day together, reinforce sort of the different threads that we've seen introduced before we get into a more regulatory approach tomorrow.
Great, thank you, Amy. All right, so the title that I noticed on the program involved sovereignty, and actually specifically it was fireside chat sovereignty in a blockchain world. And then I think we added in integration of the use case, so just to use that again to have something that we can, that's familiar that we can apply. So when I think of the word sovereignty in a blockchain context, the first thing that comes to mind is identity, as Amy foreshadowed. So just a quick show of hands. Who here has heard the phrase self-sovereign identity? A few people, but a small minority. So who here has heard people talk about, or you read something to the effect that blockchain can be used not only as a ledger, a distributed ledger for cryptocurrency, but also for digital identity, for identity somehow? That's more, a little bit under half. So I want to talk about that a little bit to sort of tick the sovereignty box. The basic thinking here is that the fact that blockchains are built upon addresses for all of the participants that contain public keys for a key pair that the participant has themselves generated, like on their own software, and that the participant, let's say, owns and controls, so that they own and control that private key. That's part of the gestalt of this vision, that the Satoshi vision of self-organizing, almost like sort of the concept of free people and free markets that can self-organize and govern themselves. Part of the technical expression of that is the key generation occurs on your phone or on your laptop, for example, as opposed to, say, something like, I don't know, in other financial services like home banking or other encrypted sessions on the web, cryptography is involved. Public key cryptography is involved, but it's happening really kind of server to server or at the business to business layer, and keys are sort of allocated session by session frequently. Maybe there's a server certificate, but individuals are not expected to, or not even enabled to, generate their own public-private key pair, manage their private key, and be known by that as an address, or be able to sign things on their own behalf, like a contract, or to a consent. Okay, it's a different paradigm, and you can use services online, like we can use DocuSign. It's a perfectly good way to generate a digital signature or an electronic signature. We can do other things, but in a sense, the highest bar of individual user-centered identity is when, with the state of the art of technology today, is when an individual has generated their own public-private key pair and has made the public key public in some way, so that people can communicate with them and can authenticate that they're the party at the other side of a transaction. So based on that starting point, a number of people realized that the key pairs that anybody can generate and manage using a blockchain wallet for cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or Ethereum can also serve not just to identify them as the equivalent of an account holder conducting a financial transaction, but also as an individual person. And so, part of applying that idea to see how far you can go with that was that prototype I showed with a mock trial of seeing what could we sign a run-of-the-day contract for sale of a car. Could I sign papers with my local city council if I wanted to run for city council as my signature, on my own behalf? Could I provide a consent of some kind? I think the answer fundamentally is yes. It's technically an elegant solution. We have this sort of globally accessible, massively distributed resource that acts almost like a meta enterprise layer to do key management and distribution. That's one of the core capabilities, some of the core functionality of the blockchain. We never had that before. There was technology for cryptography that individuals could use. There has been for decades. I remember in the 90s, we used PGP a lot at MIT. PGP, pretty good privacy, and it uses, you can generate a key pair, and we had little wallets, which we called keychains, and the way we exchanged keys with one another is we went to key parties, not the Hollywood kinds. no. But I'd say in some ways even more fun, because we were super geeked out, and it was great, and then we could securely authenticate with each other the next morning if we wanted to. I shouldn't push that. Anyway, and at the key party, the big thing we would do, we would have fun and just be ridiculous, but then we would also exchange keys. So I would know, that's Sally, and that's John, and that's David, and that's Jane. I got his or her key, and I put it in my address book. I am quite certain that this key corresponds with a private key by that person because we did an in-person key exchange. It's a really good way to do it. And then thereafter, they could be on all sorts of very insecure networks on the internet, or worse yet, the MIT network, which is hacked to bits by freshmen every year. And I know, whatever else happened, if I got a message from that person and I could verify it with their corresponding public key, it came from that person. And conversely, if I wanted to make sure something got to that person, I could encrypt it with their public key, and only they could decrypt it. Only the corresponding key can decrypt something encrypted with one key. Okay? That's the whole shtick with public key cryptography. So that doesn't scale. Well, number one, PGP and other things, no one has figured out how to make that easy. PGP was hard. There's been any number of other startups and open source projects that have tried to make it possible for individuals to generate key pairs and to manage them. No one's figured it out. And one of the first things that struck me when people were going on and on about blockchain and how great it was for currency, when I finally sat down and got a wallet and did something, the first thing that struck me, and I thought the big news was, hey, these people made it dead easy to just click a couple buttons and whiz bang, I've generated a key pair, and it works pretty well. It's not like they're the most secure things in the world, but by current information security standards for mobile phones and for laptops, it's pretty good to protect the private key material, we call it. Like someone has to concentrate some resources to go after you in order to get that. And so it's I would call it purport way better than anything that came before, let me put it like that. And really usable, which is the most important thing for key management. It can be very complicated to make things secure, very costly. The stuff was neither costly nor complicated. So fast forward a little bit, another year or two, and now people with more philosophical and political agendas, maybe, that not a bad way necessarily, who were more kind of libertarian or something like that, felt that this, well, we could really lean upon blockchains and this and their key management capability to be a source of identity of free people. Fundamentally, I don't think I'm overstating that. So that in the digital world, we could create and maintain our own identities. In the physical world, thinking back south of the border to revolutionary times in the United States, we would use paper signatures. So I think about the Declaration of Independence, and I think about my own town. I grew up mostly in Lexington, Massachusetts, outside of Boston. We've had a continuous town meeting where if you pay taxes, or excuse me, if you live in the town and are registered to vote, you can show up to like the gymnasium or the city hall, the town hall once a year, and have an equal vote for how will we allocate our local taxes, and fire, police, and what are we doing with the reservoir, roads, that kind of thing. It's an open town meeting, not so different from how it's been done for a long time. It relies upon identity, but it's implied. So if a person shows up and you can look them in the eye, and if they've signed something, we can sort of eyeball the signatures. Is it similar to the tax assessment or similar to the voter registration? These are the ways that we've done authentication in the past impliedly. You can push it on in terms of like signature and forgery, and like there's deeper science to it, but fundamentally society-wide, what I'm saying probably rings true for people that are not very, very young, where some of this is actually not, you may not be familiar with what I'm talking about, where everything's been digital, born digital, younger people. But we don't have a way to express our own individual identities in this born digital world. We have identity, but they're not ours. I have an identity when I go to MIT. It's an Athena account. I log into the network. I have an identity at General Electric. I've got an identity at various governments and various terminals, and I kind of sit down and I log in. The identity was allocated to me. Or sometimes I'm on the other side of the transaction. I'm running an X500 directory or a Windows Active Directory or something like that, and I create an account for the first day of a new hire or for a partner or whatever, and we give people identity, and we receive identity from others. We receive it from Google, we receive it from Facebook, we receive it from government agencies, we receive it from banks, we receive it from our employers. But where I ask you, is our own identity in the digital world? So on the one hand, everything we do is going digital. We're paying where's the tax guy? We're paying our taxes online. We're being educated online. Some of you out there in internet land, where's the camera? Where is it? Okay, wherever you are in internet land, oh, there you are. You are online, so you're getting educated online. Oh, and there you are too. You're everywhere. And we are doing commerce online. We're doing, healthcare increasingly, medical online. Every facet of the economy, banking, every aspect of our lives are increasingly occurring online, like the authoritative actions and behaviors are occurring online. I don't have any problem with that. I like that for many things. But it does, or it should, trigger some questions, like, how about our identity? Are we also kind of transcoding that online in a way that supports and reflects the basic social compact of what we could expect from our own identities up to now in history, up to this point in history? So let me give a couple of specific examples of things that might be possible with an identity that's digital, that people own and control, which could be afforded by blockchain, that could be legitimate if people own and control them, but may be insufficient if the identity is allocated to us by others. So the basic social compact, I think, kind of post-Enlightenment, actually this is a little funny because you guys do still sort of have the Queen as a sovereign, if I'm not mistaken. So adjusting for that, if you'll go with me that far for a moment, is that people consent to be governed, and it is from that consent that the legitimacy of the government derives. That's kind of I'm thinking Cromwell, I'm thinking Enlightenment, if you just lock those kind of people. And we say in the United States, at least, that that the sovereignty derives from people, from individuals in the aggregate are the sovereign, and the government is not just born with the right to govern, and we can change the government. This is explicit, but how do you provide consent? So like that's the big case, but you can imagine smaller cases like the government really has a need to check some new drugs out. You know, it's important public health, and we'd like to check them out on you, and you, and you. Okay, so do we need a consent for human subject experimentation? Yeah, we do. You know, post-Nuremberg and so forth. Human rights. So when you have a consent based on human rights, from whence are you consenting? There's something a little funny when you go to a doctor and they provide you the mechanism to provide consent back to them. You go to a government and they provide you the mechanism to provide consent back to them. You go to a commercial merchant, they provide you the mechanism of the identity mechanism and authorization service to provide consent back to them. This is actually a little bit weird when you think of it. Consent, fundamentally, I'm speaking like putting my lawyer hat on now, just imagine, and I should have brought two hats, is a two-party transaction. One cannot consent to oneself. It's a different kind of thing. You can decide something for yourself, but consent requires two or more parties. Does that make sense? So there's something hinky about one party holding all the cards and being able to basically, for all intents and purposes, generate, or in the bad day, concoct what had happened after the fact about with consents and server logs. When it's supposed to be, when the consent's supposed to be coming, arm's length, fair away from an external party. Somehow we need to have a meeting between parties, and each party needs to be responsible and accountable for, but also have the right to utilize their own method to come to that party, and their own method to provide consent. You could agree, what flavor, like we're going to do this with digital signatures, or maybe we're going to do it with biometrics, like that's fine. But what I'm talking about fundamentally is having a capability individually to sign something on your own behalf, and that you completely own and control. This is kind of core to the post-Enlightenment age. There's a big gaping hole in technology where that, I would say, those design requirements are supposed to be fulfilled as we're doing more and more important stuff online. Maybe some people think the blockchain could be utilized, like the key pair in blockchain could be utilized as a mechanism for people to express their identity in a way that's usable for online transactions and for other times when you need to express identity, when you need to log in, you need to authorize integration between this service and that service, like my Dropbox to my Outlook or what have you, or when you need to provide consent, upping the ante a little bit. So that's the idea of so-called self-sovereign identity. In the Media Lab, at least in the research group that I'm in the last couple-ish years, we've been using a less charged, almost political slogan from the self-sovereign identity, and we're calling it self-sourced identity. And just trying to keep it a little more, a little less hyperbolic, I guess, and talk about identity that sources from the person identified. I think that's more accurate, I think, and less dramatic way to talk about it. But self-sovereign identity, if you Google that, and I encourage you all to Google that at some point, you'll see there's a whole body and there's a bunch of startups and a bunch of people looking at that. It's a good thing to be looking at. I think we're generations of away on the maturity model, sort of grand arc of technology adoption in the sky, from having this stuff really ready for things like I signed my affidavit and I attest to this tax statement, or I consent to medical procedures, or to be governed. Like we're going to have to, this stuff will have to be even better than the blockchain wallet. Good though that may be. But that's the vision of sovereignty from blockchain. I want to show you one other thing. Can I click? I don't know why I can't click links here. I I'm great at computers. Oh, it's something's happening. Thank you. Let's have a moment of reflection. Quiet contemplation of our own identities, the nature of sovereignty. Maybe 2 moments. Cleansing breath. Identity is very complicated, so it's processing right now. Anywho, what you're about to see, I think, is a notepad document where some friends are starting to put together a bit of an article on the nature of sovereignty. Woo, this is something. Okay. Sovereignty is like a blank slate in many ways. Tabula rasa. In that, it comes from nothingness and we assert it into existence one fine day. See, I'm worried if I start talking about it and then it shows up and it's different, you'll catch me. So I feel like I really need to have this rendered before I start pretending. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Yes. Okay, so this is something that some of you will be familiar with. Kings and queens. Okay, that's the way we typically did it. And also, emperors. Yeah. And warlords. So that's the typical model of sovereignty. Okay, no surprises there. Fast forward a little bit and sprinkle some enlightenment on, and we've got a new kind of concept. And you kind of scroll how? I can't scroll. What is this thing on my cursor? Wait. Okay, so we have some links to just some of the basics of the Enlightenment there, and there's some interesting cases. So I remember when I was a government lawyer way back in early 90s, mid 90s, there's something I really depended on, and I loved, was sovereign immunity. A lot. It was my good friend. So every time like a government worker ran someone over in a government car on a government errand, or blew something up, or did some amazing thing that caused harm, in the fullness of dispute resolution, being able to lean back on like an absolute limit of our damages was real handy, especially when I was still formulating my legal skills. Having sovereign immunity is terrific. Why do we have sovereign immunity? Well, actually, okay, so who knows about sovereign immunity? Has anyone else depended on it like me, or has anyone been on the other side? Yeah. Why do we have it?
My experience is from a policing background. We had the Police Service Act and other immunities that the police had for certain actions. The public policy, you've got people that are white hats trying to do good and can't have certain things thrown their way to impede their ability. And it's the balancing of public versus private interest.
Got it. So basically, the victim just said it's basically public policy. You got the white hats, they're trying to do their job. You want them to do their job, and in order to make it work, an allocation of loss is necessary. You mentioned police. You can think of Good Samaritan statutes. Not so very different. Where in the big scheme of things, if you balance everything out, it's not that no harm was done, and could it sound in negligence or something like that? It could. Is that the result we want? And so there's a basic concept that that we like to live in civilization, and we like to overall have government, and we don't want to bankrupt the government. We don't want to drain its coffers 100%, and that there's certain public functions. One of the big things that comes to my mind is, at least around here, government has an exclusive monopoly on the use of lethal force and on the use of violence. Police, you mentioned, military, paramilitary. So that means that none of us should have to go to war against the other province, or to go to, to defend our households against a siege, like the old days before modern government. And so, in order to provide these kinds of capabilities, sovereign immunity is a mechanism to make sure that we keep having the government, and that they can plan and manage, what the reserve fund for litigation should be next year. I mean, having no clue whatsoever is difficult for a slow-moving government. There's other reasons as well. But when you kind of go a little bit deeper, okay, I can't really click this. So I'll give you the link to this, and we're actually doing a public drafting process on this sovereignty article. When you go a little bit deeper, one of the things you discover is that there's people who have been trying to extend and even bend concepts of sovereignty to see whether they might adhere outside of a classic national government. In the United States, it's somewhat radical, but when I think about it freshly, sovereignty is explicitly recognized as something that is that the states have, an equivalence of the provinces or the people, respectively, unless it's related to an explicit power that's been, allocated to the federal government in the Constitution, which was originally a small list, and we're good at interpreting that rather broadly now. But so we've actually said that it's going to subnational governments or to people, respectively. There's other cases where vessels, under maritime law, have been held to have a morsel of sovereignty. And there's some interesting cases there that we're digging up. And there's cases where there's new sovereign nations sometimes come into existence based on the agreement of a lot of people. People have tried to, there's a great example of an oil platform that was abandoned, which a bunch of techie people kind of populated and put a bunch of servers on, and they wanted to turn it into basically a sovereign entity on its own right. So now with blockchain, there's a lot of interest in this very niche, all but forgotten corner of the law in jurisprudence. And people are wondering about the possibility of creating organizations that have sovereignty and that exist, literally exist, and conduct themselves solely on blockchains. You heard earlier today this weird acronym DAO, D-A-O, Distributed Autonomous Organization. This is a real good example of what I'm talking about. So I'm going to say put two building blocks together, and people think maybe there's an opportunity to start exploring sovereign entities on a blockchain. One of those building blocks is identity that I just sort of belabored somewhat, individuals that have kind of their own identity. The other one is smart contracts. The ability to write some code that does some things, like an escrow funds and release them upon a certain condition, can listen for certain triggers and take certain actions. To basically write a smart contract that people consent to using their blockchain identities, that doesn't just do an escrow fund or maintain and preserve the books of a corporation or other types of things that these dApps are doing, but there's actually a full organization that fills out all of the functions and the flows that we'd expect from an organization. So membership lists and roles of parties and maybe types of things that the organization can do. It can hold property, and it can absorb other organizations. It can split parts of itself off. These are the types of things that people have coded into fairly complicated, like Solidity smart contracts and other contract languages. I'm sorry, I just stopped here for no particular reason, probably because I couldn't scroll. That they built into these so-called autonomous organizations, where the constitution and the functions of the organization are instantiated or like inscribed in the smart contract code. So this so far, I'm going to say, is way over the rise, and I was somewhat surprised when Amy asked me to talk about it, because I thought, well, do people need to know this for their jobs now? Absolutely not. You totally don't need to know this, in my view. But do you need to know it just to be aware of what's happening, and what are the conversations people are having, and what's bubbling up? I agree with Amy. I'm glad you did ask me to talk about this, because there is something happening for sure. There's a fair amount of money, and there's a lot of effort, and there's a lot of smart people working on creating these distributed autonomous, I'm going to call it a DAC, actually. Distributed Autonomous Corporation is much more modest than the big goal of almost like a nation state, is how it sounds to me when some people talk about it, the DAOs. But creating an autonomous, maybe, like a shoe store that just kind of does one or two transactions online and can keep track of everything, can keep track of its tax requirements, can keep track of the annual filing to maintain its corporate status, can keep track of its inventory, can keep track of its website, can keep track of its customer segmentation list, and kind of roll it together with a single authoritative source of data. That would be not bad at all. Don't necessarily need blockchain for that. I mean, you could just decide to have your company utilize a single authoritative source of data. But the truth is, when I've been involved in startups, which is quite a few of them, sometimes if it's a bunch of geeks that are starting up, we swear solemn oaths to each other that we're going to have a single authoritative source of data for a company, and then it starts expanding, or there's pressure, and then we're like, oh, except for this, we'll put in Salesforce. And except for that, it's going to be QuickBooks, obviously, because and we make all these compromises, and before you know it, it's a fractured mess, and we don't know our own organization. We can't track things all the way through, and we're just, like everybody else, just trying to survive day by day and quarter by quarter. So there's something interesting about this idea of using blockchains, where a lot of assumptions are questioned to start with, and it's an opportunity to have a fresh start, to maybe take one more whack at a very prudent vision for the management of business with technology, and that is specifically encoding all the things that it does and all the data that it has under a single architecture and with a single authoritative source of truth, not totally fractured across a bunch of systems. It's not unreasonable. And so there's actually a startup that, I forgot to mention this to you, but I'll say it now. There's a new project that I'm going to do in January and February in Tel Aviv with a couple of startups and some US people that we're calling CorpBot, CORPBOT.com. CorpBot.com, don't bother looking yet, because I need to, maybe on the plane ride back, finish the website. But it's a concept to basically create a completely integrated, simplest possible corporation. In the US, would be like an S Corp, or it might be a one-member LLC, something like that. And to run it through a corporation with a Secretary of State, maybe Kansas, because it has an API for that, maybe another state, and to have it, create a website and kind of basically like unpack itself to do a few simple transactions and to maintain its legal operations, and that everything that occurs be on a single log, and make sure the log is auditable, and be able to look at all the activity. And then the idea is to basically use some simple data and analytics, like eigenvectors and Markov chains, and I don't know, just various ways to measure the behaviors of the company and to see the deep patterns of it, and to basically be able to manage our own organization all the way through by having everything that it ever does capable of being computationally addressed. Let me put it like that, because we have all the data and we have all of the activities and all the state changes that ever happened. Okay, so that's emerging, and that's maybe one day in the future, like a township or a county or an entity like that will express itself not across 275 different systems that can never. It's like Humpty Dumpty. You can never put it back together again. But maybe we'll start to see unified data processes of entities that already are sovereign. That's one way you can get there, or of new types of entities that are maybe emerging. As as we move into the digital age. What was the other topic? Was sovereignty in a blockchain world. Okay. Well, those are some ruminations on sovereignty in a blockchain world. Was there anything else you wanted me to address in there? Okay, so, is it Miller time? Okay, it's almost time, but should we take a few moments to,
Questions?
yeah, for discussion?
Yeah, for discussion and questions, and then, let's limit that to 5 minutes.
Okay.
I'm gonna do a wrap up in 5 minutes.
I think that's great. 5 minutes of anything goes time. So, sir.
So anybody who's put in like an SAP system or an Oracle system, there's always that promise of one version of the truth, which
Yeah.
you're kind of talking about. And in
It's
here,
a lie.
right, it never happens.
Never happens.
And like whether it's because of like the laws of entropy,
Oh, thanks, Amy.
anybody who's ever put in an SAP system or an Oracle system knows that there's always the promise of one version of the truth, and it never happens. Whether it's the laws of entropy or something, invariably human element or the great forces of the universe conspired to make that not happen. And it sounds like just what you were just talking about runs hard against that. And I'm just curious if those human elements or those factors that are somehow intervening in all these practical expressions we've historically seen that run against one version of a truth or one system of record. It's like the Matrix. Like, doesn't it at some point fall apart for reasons? And how do you address that in the things that you're developing?
What a great question. Did everybody kind of get the question? Did anybody not get it? Okay, so so the short answer is I don't know. And that's partly why I want to spend time this January and February actually creating something that has, for real, a single source of truth for everything in the entity, and then let it run, in lab conditions first, and do that however many times is necessary before it isn't a total failure, and then starts working, and then eventually kind of let it off the leash a little bit, and be able to measure it and see how it does, doing some low cost, not sensitive, hardly mission critical kind of trivial things, and kind of see how it goes, and then I think I'll have a better idea. Speculation right now about some of the problems with this include, number one, the main issue. So you mentioned SAP and other so-called ERP systems. The main thing with those is, my experience, it's not, it can create a single source of truth within its scope and domain. So it's like a human resources and compensation management ERP system. You can pretty much force everything. It didn't happen if it doesn't appear in the system, or if it's like a supply chain or a purchasing system, like you can kind of force things there, like comptrollers will simply not write a check unless it shows up here, even if you have to go back and do it again. But the issue that we're trying to solve is a little bit different, although even what I just said is Herculean, to get everything to actually happen in the system. And when there's like a really urgent deal and the CEO or the governor or someone's like saying, just make it happen, like it's really hard to not just kind of make it happen. But you can do that. Like I think MIT's done actually a great job at making all our purchasing and some of our other stuff happen in a system. And it took a long time and a lot of cultural change to make that happen. Where some of it falls down is, how do you know how many systems there are that when you add them all up, there's nothing else that is your entity? Well, is it my email? Is it my visitor logbook? Is it my, every change on every website? Is it, every network state and every server? Is it, and then all the back office stuff. Is it every memo that every attorney ever did, and is it every web search they did? So just knowing what does everything even mean, is one sort of existential question that we're gonna try to tackle in an honest way and make everything that's authoritative, you know, and that's important somehow to the company, exist in a unified data structure. And then I think the other thing, I think honestly, like the way these things go, I'll probably be dead if I live a long time before this ever happens. But if we could do it, and then you kind of look way into the future, some people worry already that we'll have another problem, which is over-reliance on this. Did you mention the matrix? Yeah, so that's very savvy. So some people are very up in arms already, including our collaborators here and our partners for CorpBot, that, you know, this is a bad idea because the malevolent robot overlords will crush us, obviously, immediately, as soon as, you know, we write the first line of code. I don't really foresee that happening anytime soon, but it's a legit human instinct question about, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, and it's been a theme throughout the day, which is what is appropriate for human review and judgment, and what's appropriate to happen in an automated way or occur on chain, or even in AWS in some, you know, some service that you made. And you know, I think these questions remain to be seen. Part of the reason we're doing this through MIT, this CorpBot exercise, is in order to try to get a little bit more real about what the possibilities and capabilities are, but also perhaps the risks and dangers, so we can kind of take a clear-eyed view of them, and you know, add to the knowledge of that. You know, so going forward, maybe we can make better decisions and target investment better. I believe, and I suspect, that there is a lot of good value on the table to be had for people running businesses that want to manage them more efficiently and be more agile and be able to adapt to the environment and change their own organization faster. For government, for sure, for regulators, for partners in the supply chain, for everybody who can, the whole value chain. If we could just agree to not make that, you know, original sin compromise of fracturing the systems of a single entity, and just try to play it through all the way with all the official important data in a, if not a single authoritative source, like an identified and manageable set of sources. So that proper data management and application and like infrastructure management that is unified, so that we can know what's happening and get real-time monitoring. We can go back and do historical analysis, better predictive analytics, and roll out changes in a rational way, as opposed to the painful way it is to change everything now, and to even wonder what the implications would be for changing things, or how much it would cost, or how long it would take, or who would be involved, and what connections are we breaking, and all those kind of things. So anyway, there's some ruminations on sovereignty. Okay, and that's probably like way more time than you said I had. So I want to just say it's been great being here. I always love doing things with Amy, but it's been terrific talking to the few of you that I've had a chance to connect with, and I appreciate the questions and really like the other speakers. I just want to thank you all for being so, you know, kind of bringing your A game to this. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Daza, for being here and supporting the whole initiative, and being a real voice of wisdom and insight in every way. So thank you.
Thank you.
3 things. Your journal